I'm Greg Lindsay, and yeah, long before I was part of the founding team of CoMotion, it's good to be back. I wrote the book Aerotropolis, The Way We'll Live Next, which was sort of looking at the future, not only of air travel and globalization, but of sort of the infrastructures that we were building to support it, and how airports have become so central in our globalized world that we were spawning new forms of urbanism around it. And, it was interesting at the time that my book came out in 2011, reported a lot of it through, of course, the financial crisis and the oil prices at the time. There were a lot of responses to that book, the notion that air travel was going to go away because of high fuel prices, or that we should stop flying because of obviously sustainability issues. And that, of course, during the pandemic, we saw all sorts of predictions how video conferencing, like what we're doing right now, would eliminate the need for live events, which we see is obviously not the case. And of course, air travel has simply, has rebounded since the pandemic. Both leisure has exploded. We've seen also new kinds of travel. Off-peak is combined with remote work to basically spread travel all around, and even business travel has rebounded there. So the interesting bits of this timing, and of course, for this event, is that it falls into this combination of we're having a whole new generation of terminal infrastructure that is coming online. Are Americans ready for their air travel to be nice for once, at least on the ground side, with new terminals at LaGuardia, under construction at JFK, over at Newark, that's just the New York area. Of course, Kansas City opening new terminals and new innovations at Seattle Tacoma at SeaTac, which we'll hear a bit about today. So we're going to talk a bit about this new wave of post everything, post 9/11, post financial crisis, post pandemic air travel infrastructure, and really sort of for the first time in a generation, we have a way to rethink about not only how we fly and where to, but also how we move to these terminals and how we build ground supporting mobility to bring people to them. So I'm very excited for this session today, dwelling upon a topic that I know and love very well. So with that, I'd like to invite out my fellow panelists, Warren Schramm from Teague and Amber Simonson from Alaska Airlines, to talk about some of the innovations that they have been intimately involved with, and rethinking about, what this sort of new era of American air travel might look like. And of course, on the horizon further along, which I don't know if we'll get into, is of course, the push to electrify and decarbonize transportation, new forms of aerial mobility, which we've hosted at CoMotion Miami, things like Regit's Sea Glider and others that are under development. So there's a lot to talk about. So thank you so much, Amber and Warren, for joining us.
Thanks, Greg.
All right, great to have you here. I should note, by the way, unfortunately, Joyce from Airports to Paris was unable to join us because, and you will not believe this, is she had a travel mishap. And so, of course, she was unable to join us at the appointed hour. So some things perhaps will never change. But we still have lots to talk about. And I would definitely encourage all of you who are here in attendance. I like to get everyone involved as soon as we can. We have an hour on the clock. Please submit questions through the chat or through Q&A. And I'll start calling on you after 20 or 25 minutes or so, and we'll start weaving this all in together. So by all means, please give me your questions. But first, let's hear from Amber and Warren about what they've been working on and their thoughts on this sort of new paradigm of that. And let's start with Amber, who's particularly in charge of sort of Alaska's lobby experience, which is that crossing that threshold from the city and from drop-off before you go through the TSA checkpoint from landside into airside. How is that experience being transformed, Amber? And how are you approaching this to make air travel less painless, or less painful, more painless all the time?
That's right. Thanks, Greg. At Alaska, we've really been thinking about transforming that part of the customer journey, because when you think about it, and this is something we hear from our guests all the time, is that piece that happens before you get to security. It's such an unknown, and it creates stress, it creates anxiety. And then, of course, if you start to see lines in that lobby experience, that anxiety builds and you swear that you're going to be 30 minutes earlier than you were last time. And so what we wanted to do is to say, what if we could reduce that stress? We could reduce the confusion, so people have a reliable, consistent experience in the lobby, especially if they're dropping bags. And so our goal is, when we're done with this transformation over the next couple of years, is that all of our guests will have a 5-minute or less lobby experience. And that's enabled through new processes, that's enabled through new technology that's within the lobby experience itself, as well as turning these outdated kiosks that we see all over the place, saying goodbye to those and really saying hello to, let's do everything on our smartphone when we get there. And then what we're really talking about is putting smart devices into the airport environment where guests can just print their bag tag, drop it off, and be on their way.
Very interesting. I mean, can you talk a little bit more quickly about some of the technologies involved with doing that? Because obviously there's been all sorts of interesting experiments about RFID with luggage. We've seen, of course, the rise of air tags with various travelers. There's a lot of personalized tech involved. And I'm curious, how do you rethink the kiosks, which once upon a time were an innovation to print out my boarding pass. I admit I'm old enough that I still like to have that paper copy, I must admit. But yeah.
I'll get you to the other side, Greg, I'll promise.
Thank you. Well, this is good. How do you evaluate like how much tech should be left to the consumer, the flyer, versus like how much you want to internalize, and where's that line shifting?
Yeah, it's so interesting because Alaska was actually one of the very first airlines to put in kiosks, and we're one of the first ones domestically to take them out. And so it's interesting to just see how we've evolved, and just what we know about folks using smartphones when they travel. If there's not a ton of good that came from the pandemic, but if there's one thing, is what we saw was the cross-generational adoption of smartphones for kind of daily tasks, whether it's our parents now ordering food to be delivered to their house, to groceries, to booking Ubers and Lyfts. Like, we've really gotten used to this ecosystem where our phone is central to travel. And so what we saw was like, okay, if folks are carrying these devices with them, what can we do to really ease this journey? And we know the airport's a stressful environment. There's lines, it's unfamiliar, and most people don't spend a lot of time there. And so we thought, what if we could get all the activities as much as possible to happen in the comfort of your own home, or in the comfort of your hotel room, where you know where you're going to sit on the airplane, you're all checked in, that there's no problems with your ticket. You've been able to kind of indicate that you're going to check your bag, you've already paid for it. That really brings a sense of calm. And so that's something that we are moving towards right now. And then in the airport itself, we talked about technology. We've introduced an iPad-based solution that prints bag tags. And it's very simple. It's a 45-second transaction, which is hard to think about because we all are used to spending like 2 to 3 minutes at the kiosk, plucking away, just looking things up and kind of just spending more time than we really needed to in that kind of confined airport environment. Now it's a quick scan of your digital boarding pass, you print it out, you stick it, and you drop your bag. And it's really transformed how people think about lobbies. It's funny because you probably remember, Greg, where we started to think, oh, should this be like someplace that people dwell? It's like, well, no. Airports can't get bigger in a lot of situations, especially here on the West Coast. I fly out of SeaTac International Airport all the time, and we can't grow space-wise, but what we can do is make better use of our space. And so we're partnering with the Port of Seattle right now, where we're doing a $500 million investment to improve the entire north end of the terminal where Alaska operates. And it's really about creating better throughput, a beautiful space, but that's enabled by technology to process more folks through.
Interesting. Well, I want to come back to this because this idea, which has been really endemic in travel, of the notion of like lines going away, of customer service agents coming to you. We've seen it in hotels with the transformation to hotel lobby. So I think it's really interesting when you describe it as a lobby. You can see the direct line there. But I want to go to Warren, obviously. For those of you who know Teague, I always think of Teague as very, very quiet. Teague, of course, is best known probably for its work on aircraft itself as a very close partner with Boeing, but obviously Teague does a lot with the airport experience as well. I'm curious, Warren, like obviously, how do you see this transformation happening? And is this part of the sort of larger trend as well about, the sort of like the dispersal of the airport, which I think is really interesting because post 9/11, we did try to build bigger terminals, and it was about dwell time, and it was about, people who were afraid and showing up 3 hours early, all of the warnings of this. How is that transforming more broadly than just sort of SeaTac and this notion of decreased anxiety and decreased dwell time?
I think, as Amber mentioned, the pandemic was really a boon for educating folks on how to use things touchlessly, how to interact with technology in ways that a lot of frequent travelers were already accustomed to. But the world as a whole became more accustomed to using our cell phones to do everything from sitting down at a restaurant, scanning a QR code, bringing up the menu, and placing the order there, which was all foreign concepts for us in the US, at least. It was more popular outside the US. And so that has led to this ability to have that personal technology space, as Amber was talking about, that we can now embrace. And if the airport services can be distributed not only to that device, but outside the airport walls into the rest of our environment, that's something that really changes things. So that whole experience that we got used to in the pandemic, this is the rise of the gig economy that led to us taking rides, and then eventually folks delivering us food or packages or anything else wherever we are, whether that's at home and work, or even if we're traveling, that distribution is something now that people take for granted and expect. And the airport has traditionally been kind of this walled garden where once you're in there, you are focused on the event of traveling. At least here in the US, it's not common to go to the airport for any other reason than that. And so what we're hoping to see is that those external services through technology can now be integrated more into that space so that all of the things that we're accustomed to getting in our outside world are now available in the inner space of these terminals. And the terminals themselves need to be exposed in that same way to all of those passengers. So it's not just the frequent travelers that know where a certain restaurant is or a certain shop is within an airport or how to navigate that airport. Any person coming into the airport needs to be able to connect to it in the way that they're used to connecting outside. So if I'm going to go order food, it may come from inside the airport, but I don't know any different than me being outside the airport. That's really where technology can start to bridge these things together without a person having to become a master at it or be some seasoned veteran traveler to make that happen.
Interesting. Well, the follow-up to that, Award, is I'm sort of curious again your thoughts on like sort of where does this ultimately lead to in the next generation of terminal design? And I want to come back to Amber, also how Alaska is thinking about this too, because again, I'm curious how you see these technologies already at play in the new terminals that have opened across the United States and just really some of the last 6 months. And then how does this push forward going forward? Because I remember it was 15 years ago that I interviewed Moshe Safdie, the Canadian-Israeli architect who did Toronto Pearson 1 and Ben Gurion. And he talked about this notion too, that like the idea of dispersing the airport, like doing remote check-in, thinking about all these things where until the airport is everywhere, that the airport and the city blur together in his mind. And it feels like we're starting to realize that a bit more with some of this technology. So how do we start to rethink the difference between airside, landside, and the city beyond?
I think there's a great opportunity to look at what are the services that an airport provides besides the actual travel. So if you take bag checking, for example, if I'm going to go at my hotel and check my bag for my flight at my hotel, that bag is then going to get transported to the airport and carried off. Well, what if there's a holding area within the city itself, not necessarily at the airport, for those bags that can route them wherever I need them? So that I don't necessarily use that bag checking service always when I'm traveling. I may go downtown, check my bag there, get on a scooter, go do something else where I don't need that equipment and for that part of the day, just because I'm downtown. And then I can pick that bag up somewhere else in town because the routing services are all available for my goods wherever I need them to be. That's where we see like this next generation coming into play. It's not just one of the dreams that we've talked about in the past is being able to get cleared on TSA while you're traveling on the light rail because the corridor is protected. You can get screened, you can go through. Facial recognition technology is allowing for those things. But what are those services? What are the things that an airport, that a traveler needs that are actually needed well beyond just a traveler? Especially when you look at micromobility solutions in the city and things of that nature. I think there are elements like that bag check that can be distributed out and leveraged everywhere. In large metropolitan areas.
Very interesting. Well, obviously that'll have a huge influence on facilities in terms of being able to process that if and when that comes to pass. Amber, I want to come back to you for a sec because it's interesting in talking about, I'm curious about like the metrics that you use to define success with the lobby experience, because I think of this as, I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but like, I think the two largest revenue centers for airports are of course not landing fees, but it's like parking and concessions. And the idea, if you make it more convenient where they don't need to park, where you can process faster, or you don't need all those facilities on the ground side as Warren described. And also I don't need to show up 3 hours early because my anxiety is lessened. That must have an impact on concessions. So how does your lobby experience interact with what you're redesigning on the air side of the terminal? And how do we start to imagine that transforming? Because again, post 9/11, we saw airports go all in on huge concession areas and F&B overhauls and everything else. But it sounds like that might start to transform again, that we're entering a new paradigm post that.
It's interesting that you bring that up because what people always tell us is that they feel calmer as soon as they make it through TSA. Like that's the kind of moment. It's why we invest so much in our lounge experience, because we know that's something that's very desirable, especially for frequent travelers. But we also know that folks, they want to get to the other side. They want to get their cup of coffee. They want to get to the other side and go to their favorite restaurant that's only at the airport, or maybe they only go when they go to the airport. And so we still think there's a role there. And we know as well that folks are looking for a diverse set of concessions as well as services that happen post security. And so I don't know that we're trying to rush folks through the entire experience. There's still value in getting to the airport with enough time to kind of enjoy the concessions or the amenities that you like at your particular airport. But we do want to make sure that we can get you post security as quickly as possible. And it's interesting. We've done some partnerships with some of our airports where we're actually allowing folks who are not frequent travelers, who don't have clear, who are not elite flyers, where they can save their spot in the TSA line. And that's been hugely successful. It's something that we hear a lot from guests, that it just gives them that peace of mind that it's like, I know what time one, I need to arrive. And so as they think about kind of backing up their arrival time to the airport, they now center on what is the time that I need to arrive in the TSA line based on, we call it CTAC Spot Saver, but it happens throughout the US. There's more and more airports adopting this system to really bring more clarity and consistency to that process.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Warren, before you add that.
Well,
So there's a lot to learn actually between Disney World and airports in that regard with that kind of technology and FastPass and everything else. But I'm sorry, go ahead, Warren.
yeah, it's more than Disney too. It's the same thing we see with our ride sharing service. The ability to predict when a space will be open, when you can slide someone in, and managing all of that on the fly is what we've grown very good at over the last few years. There's an opportunity now for airports. You think about it, like over the 90s and the early 2000s, we watched the mall that used to be kind of the epicenter of all activity within suburbia and things of that nature. Even downtown in cities, the malls were a big place where people went to go shopping. And the airport is becoming that kind of a destination. It's the thing that has survived, right? People go to the airport specifically for shops because the prices are different, or the goods that they get are so luxurious, things they don't see anywhere else. If that can be opened up to not just be something for the traveler, but for everyone to go through, or if we can find a way to optimize this throughput where I can visit these places in transit somewhere else, just as the airport being a hub of transit, not necessarily between cities, but even between local areas as I'm just flying through, or just going through on the light rail or whatever my metropolitan transit solution is, then all of those pieces of technology that facilitate those kind of momentary interactions, whether it's finding your spot in line or getting into a shop so that you know that the volume in that shop is low, or picking up your goods on the way to another destination, all of those things make this a much more vibrant place to be.
Interesting. Well, speaking of ride hail in that regard, I'm curious. I'll go Amber, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts, Warren, too. I mean, obviously, ride hail has had a massive effect on airport layouts. I think I saw a statistic once that the 17% of all Uber rides were to and from airports. Like that's how much ride hailing was. And obviously, we watched airports like LAX, having to design completely off-board areas and all sorts of other disruptions to that. Amber, I guess start with you. Like, how are you seeing people arrive at Alaska, at SeaTac, and your other airports as well too? And how is that mix changing? Because obviously, I think of this because 2 generations ago, airports like Kansas City and Dallas-Fort Worth, when people in the post 9/11 experience wondered why these airports had such terrible layouts, is because they were designed from the beginning that you would arrive and flow right through it onto your gate with almost no minimal time. It was an era before the TSA even existed. And it strikes me as like we're almost going back to that now. So how is the ground interface with airports changing to allow that maximal throughput? And what innovations can we make to accelerate that even further? So I'd love to hear your thoughts, Amber.
Well, it's so interesting because we have this opportunity with the construction project at SeaTac. We actually looked at how people are flowing into the airport. And if you're familiar with that area, there's a departures deck where at the northmost end, you've got light rail folks, and they're coming up the escalator. And at that same point, it's the northmost side of the parking garage. Well, it's also the very first door where someone could be dropped off at the airport. And so we typically see a lot of congestion here, which we all know congestion in an airport, especially when you're just trying to get someone dropped off, it's not good for anybody. It's not good for the traveler. It's not good for our Uber and Lyft drivers. Like we want to open up those areas. And so because we were able to get this data, and it's really mixed, I will tell you, I was shocked. I thought more and more people would be arriving this way. We still have a number of folks who park. We have a number of guests who use offsite parking lots, as well as folks that are coming off the light rail. And what we see is that we actually needed to move a door. And I think because we were looking at this construction project, we were able to optimize the door locations to reduce congestion on the departure curve, adjust signage, and then also think about the inside. I mean, how many times have airports, you enter a door and it's just not the smartest place to enter, right? You almost enter into a crowd, which you don't want. And so we've been able to be very purposeful about where folks are entering the terminal, and then directing them using digital signage, as well as just kind of physical factors like the color of the terrazzo that's supposed to be the throughput, right? I mean, really, really smart design choices to help guide folks and pull them through to that other side. I found it so interesting. We had almost 30% of our guests at SeaTac that were actually going into our lobby area who were not checking a bag. Like those are folks that just don't need to be kind of taking up that space, but they really just didn't understand where to go. They felt like they had to talk to someone. So part of it's education on the part of the airline, so we can help those guests. And when they feel confident and equipped with their smartphone that they can just go straight to security, that really helps all of us that do need to go into the lobby environment to drop a bag or to take advantage of a special service. It helps free that space up so they can flow right through.
Thank you. And then, yeah, what are you seeing as well in terms of also more broadly in terms of like rethinking the entire spatial layouts of airports to accelerate that sort of ground interface?
I do think we still, at least in the US, we have a major choke point with security. I think if getting that can be distributed outside of the airport grounds, we've seen a lot of discussions recently around how facial ID technologies or other identity products could make that easier so that the ground opens up, like where we can arrive, how we move through opens up by having that identity pieces done. What I think is really fascinating about this, and this ties back to what Alaska and Amber are doing, is that in a few years ago, there was a large push against any facial recognition technology whatsoever. Socially, it was seen as this terrible thing. But it seems that the airline industry and our travel industry seems to be changing the tide to where people are more comfortable with this because of that choke point. So as far as the navigation is concerned, I think that's the next major hurdle to overcome. As there's a lot we can do on the initial arrival side, but once you get into the actual air side of the airport, it's that transition that still needs a ton of work. And I'm hoping that in the next 5 years or so, we can see that distribute, and then we can come to all different parts of the airport. We can have kind of that straight get out of the car, walk through, and be at the gate near immediately, and then just go to other amenities as need be. That's the goal, but security is really the gate that has to be figured out first. And it looks like technology may be the big player to make that happen. And so I'm hoping that services like this, where people can come through and check their bag and be identified in using facial recognition, that starts to give a positive spin to people around it. It's not just for identifying criminals and things like that. This has actual benefit for us as travelers, so that we can be, we don't have to be checked all the time every time we go through a checkpoint.
All right, well, I'll just to follow up on that one, I'm curious. This is a thought I've always had and never figured out how to reconcile it. I've always thought it's interesting. I'm a TSA pre-check, global entry, clear. I have all of the above, giving away my biometrics. But I find it ironic and interesting in the sense of the TSA, because of those programs, has in fact become a customer service organization.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it sometimes they can't figure out whether they are there to protect us against all threats against the nation, or in fact they are running a marketing operation. When the fact that we know for Clear, for example, gives percentages back, referrals back to airports for proselytizing there. It's a weird, bizarre tension. I'm curious, like, is there a resolution to this? It's been over 20 years since 9/11, and that security infrastructure, can it ever be dismantled? I guess I'm giving you that tough question there, because if some of that could be rolled back, that would make a huge game changer to airports. But for political reasons, in addition to security that we may or may not know about, they're reluctant to. But like, how do we dismantle some of the checkpoints? You're right about the tech can do some of it too, but can the physical footprint be reduced? Or how can TSA resolve some of its internal tensions about these tiered services, or how to basically smooth that for every other passenger? I mean, I've had to explain to my young children why we take our shoes off in airports. One guy once 20 years ago did that, and we're still doing it. I find it strange. Yeah.
I think you raise a very interesting distinction between this, though, because there is the show of TSA and there is the job and the work of TSA. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the functions of TSA can be distributed out, whether that is securing and checking our bags well outside of the airport and making sure that they're in a contained environment all the way there, so we don't have to worry about that. There are scanners that can be non-intrusively done as you walk through, not to harken back to Total Recall back in the day, where you saw people scanned and walking through their scanners. That tech is actually becoming more viable. We see it being used in Dubai, I believe. And the facial recognition for actual identity is there. But there is also this feeling of, I know that I was safe because I went through this checkpoint. And I think that is the piece that needs to be overcome. Technology can handle all of the other pieces of it. The scanning, the actual mechanics of making sure that someone is safe. But the evolution to, say, similar to what we've done now with having our tickets on our phone, that piece that gives the peace of mind to the traveler to say, no, I am safe to get on this plane, we haven't reached a point yet where that problem is being tackled, right? That is the next horizon, I think, to go through. And then we can see the breakdown of things, and Clear and others may become silent kind of services that we don't even think about. We need them. They're part of, maybe they're part of the solution. Maybe that's the thing that makes you feel safe, is that you get some clear verified check that comes up as you go through things. Or there's some billboards that tell you how many passengers have been screened at any given point in time, or it's been X number of days since they made the incident. So these things don't happen that often because of the amount of security there. But that awareness is the piece that we need to figure out. And if we treat it as a separate entity, I think there will be more innovation that happens around it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, people want a cordon to know they feel safe. They've crossed a cordon. Amber, I'll come back to that. So we talked a bit about CTAC. I want to come back to how you're rolling this out in terms of that, because of course airports change very slowly over decades. And so, you know, in terms of your sort of new lobby experience, like how are you rolling out in Portland and sort of other airports that Alaska sort of focuses out of? And like, what's the rate of change? How do we accelerate the rate of change inside airports? Because again, I mean, just post 9/11, like, you know, it took years and years for them to even adopt permanent infrastructure versus the very ad hoc add-ons that were made then. So have we gotten better at that in terms of actually rolling out and systematizing our improvements to airports?
You know, it's so interesting. We have really great partners at Port of Portland, Port of Seattle, Port of San Francisco, and we're working with them to really create these incredible spaces that help facilitate that flow. The other piece, though, is that technology. And it's so interesting what Warren was saying in terms of adoption. One of the things that I think everyone seems to be concerned about is, what if my phone dies and I need paper? Like, that seems to be the number one question I get. I was like, here's the thing. What happens if your gate changes? Because your paper boarding pass will never tell you. It never will. And your phone always will. And I think that's the thing. We constantly look for an excuse to hold on to the thing that's familiar, yet we are better served sometimes by the thing that is right in our hands. And I always question folks, how many times has your phone actually died in the TSA line before you went through screening? And it's rare, right? I actually get to meet someone who literally, they have their boarding pass up on their phone and they get to the front of the TSA line and their phone actually dies. Like, I actually don't know anyone, and I know a lot of people. So it is a fear that we work through. It is perfectly natural. I think all of us used to travel with paper boarding passes. We love them. We put them in scrapbooks and we use them as the bookmark for our paper book that we read when we were on the plane, right?
Yes.
And so it's kind of moving past that. I mean, we're digitizing bag tags to this point. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting. Alaska's put out, we have it kind of in a test mode right now where we're working with some select flyers. They're testing these electronic bag tags that completely skip the entire going to get a sticker to stick on our bags. And you're just going to the airport with that already happening. And then you're proceeding. And in the future, you'll be proceeding to an automated bag drop that's biometrically enabled, where you can show your face, you drop your bag, and you don't even have to see a person, which we hear from our guests. It's like, yes, I want to get through this process as quick as possible. Have your wonderful, friendly people there if I have a problem, and have your wonderful, friendly, and caring people on the plane as my flight attendant and my pilot, right? That's what we really want. That's where we want the interaction. So we were talking a little bit about adoption, and it's interesting because we have rolled out this new bag tag process, as well as having folks come to the airport ready with their digital boarding passes. We've rolled out in 9 of our airports so far, Portland being our largest, our hub. And we have seen over 80% of travelers come to the airport with those digital boarding passes. A few are coming with print at home, which is totally fine. Those work too. We know there are those folks who's like, I want both. I want to have the one on my hand and the one on my phone. That's okay. And it's interesting because we've mobilized our agents to be more in the lobby. They also have iPads with them, and they're able to assist guests who are either new to this process and don't understand. They're right there to help guide them. And then in those very few situations, I think in each of the airports we've launched, we've had at least one person says, you know, I'm just going to really need that paper boarding pass. And they're able to remotely print and get them that. But it's definitely, we're seeing the tide shift, which is super exciting. The other thing we're just seeing is when we looked at kiosk usage before we put in this new process, it sat somewhere around, the 20 to 30% of all folks who checked a bag. And we're seeing those numbers double once we put in this new process, which means folks, again, are getting through the airport faster. They're not waiting in these very long assistance lines where you have to go and kind of go through this kind of traditional process. People are freeing themselves up from that, and they're really getting to have an airport experience, and that tees them up to have a great flight, which means you enjoyed your travel more. And of course, if you enjoy your travel, you want to do it again.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Amber. I would say, as someone who steps inside an airport, reflexively goes to a kiosk to print out my paper boarding pass just to have it, you make me want to give back my million-miler tags. I feel like I don't deserve them now. I feel like
No.
Mom and Pa Kettle. But we'll go to that. Thank you for those who are bringing in questions here. I appreciate it. We'll get into them. Well, let's start with this one. There's a fun one, a light one to get us started here from this one. Yeah, we'll go with this one. As experts in airport design, I'm curious to ask you all, which is your favorite airport and why? I get the feeling that Amber is going to name just one of a couple there. But Warren, I would love to hear your thoughts from Teague's perspective on this. And I guess maybe narrow it down. Which of the new airports, the new terminals, do you think has done it the best or has aspects of it that you really like? So otherwise, I could wax rhapsodic about Schiphol all day here. But yeah, Warren, what do you think is of the new crop at LaGuardia, Newark, and others has maybe the best feature or maybe the thing that you love the most?
LaGuardia is gorgeous, and the flow there is amazing. I can tell you that in all of our ideation and design conversations, the airport that gets brought up the most is Singapore. Changi is like that. That is, it's been a gold star. It's been the thing that we talk about the most. The things that are innovative there, the blend between what is there for the community, versus what is there for the traveler, is a constant piece for us to talk about. And then locally, we do a lot of work with YVR, and the piece that I think is really interesting about YVR, it's one of my favorite airports, is just the cultural richness that is there. It feels very different than any other airport I've been through. You just feel presenced in the Pacific Northwest and in the indigenous people that are there, and I absolutely adore it.
YVR is Vancouver for all you non-airport code nerds out there. I know we're having a fun game here. Amber, what's your favorite choice?
It's interesting just because I've been able to see what Portland will be. Portland's been a longtime favorite of folks of the Pacific Northwest. They're kind of known for that like signature carpet, if you remember from a few years ago. Like it just has this following. They've always had very innovative concessions. It's a big airport that feels small. And I think that's really something special. And what they're bringing to life under the new construction for their entire lobby, it's going to be incredible. And so I hate to say something's my favorite before I've actually physically walked through it, but I'm very excited to see what's possible, especially as we introduce the new technology with the bag take stations, with the new setup, with automated bag drop. I mean, it's going to be fantastic. And the best part is it's literally happening next year. Like 2024, we're going to see the future come to life, which I get excited about. But in terms of an airport that already exists, I'm a little partial to the lobby work that Nashville has just done. It's absolutely stunning. They've created some really amazing outdoor spaces. They've done a great job with digital signage, as well as creating a place that really draws you to the other side. Now they have all the space that they need to do all those kind of things, which is interesting, but really a beautiful execution and a personal favorite of mine.
Great. If I could wear my expert non-moderator hat for a moment, I guess the one I'm most looking forward to is going to be the Chicago O'Hare International Terminal. I was privileged to do some early ideation sessions with Jeannie Gang's team for that, the Studio Ord team. It's Studio Gang and Corrigan and a bunch of other great architects are working on that. And yeah, I can't wait to replace the ancient Terminal 2 at O'Hare with a modern facility, combine the two. It's a great experience to know that you are helping design the structure that will tear down what you're walking through in an airport. It's always a good time. All right, so getting more questions. David has a question here. When it comes to airport airline employee commutes, what progress have you seen airports, airlines, in providing shared rides to help alleviate the traffic for travelers? That's a great question there. Yeah, obviously, Amber, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one too, in terms of employees and staffing, in terms of how you made this an easier process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things is we do have a partnership with Lyft, which we've just seen just an increased use in ride sharing to the airport, which really helps eliminate some of the parking congestion that we see in these very constrained parking garages. The other thing we do is offsite with a combination of on-site parking for employees, depending on the airport, what those situations are. But it's interesting. It's when we see the use of light rail coming into an airport, we see just higher usage, and we incentivize employees through offering transit passes and things of that sort to really help the multimodal approach to getting towards the airport.
Great. Let's go. I would say here's one for Warren. Tiana May asks, is departure is very much the priority at the moment? That's what we mostly talked about today. Are there also aspects of arrivals you think of the potential for development at airports? I would love your thoughts on this. As someone who, on the rare occasion, I got to use an arrivals lounge at Heathrow and elsewhere on international flights, this ability of having facilities there would be wonderful to discuss. So yeah, I'm curious, like, what do you see as the great innovations there?
I don't know. So arrivals are interesting because am I at my destination, or am I still in transit? Am I just in a transfer, or am I actually where I want to stop? I think what we've been talking about a lot as far as the arrival experiences is moving that actually more onto the plane, allowing services to come up in your onboard entertainment system to pre-book or pre-set up the places where you want to be when you arrive, and then have those facilities available to you. So within the airport itself, I think having those facilities so that you could get items that you may have remembered that you were missing on your trip, having those available when you deplane, or right where you need to go to pick up your ground transportation, or in those sorts of facilities, I think are really a space to innovate and push things, and also to start making connections with other people that you may want to interact with while you're there, understanding the events that are going to be happening there, especially things that may be happening on or near the airport.
Yeah, Amber, the same. Obviously, it's not your under your bailiwick, but how is Alaska rethinking arrivals in that regard too? Or like, are there comparable innovations there in terms of accelerating the flow out of the airport as well as in?
Well, it's interesting because Alaska was a bit ahead of the curve when we introduced our 20-minute baggage guarantee. So from the time that the plane is, docked at the sky bridge, or excuse me, the jet bridge, and then from the time your bag is actually showing up on the belt, it's 20 minutes, and it's fantastic. And it's one of those things that we hear from our guests that really helps them on that arrivals journey, because if you can get out of the airport sooner, to kind of Warren's point, it's like that facilitates you getting a ride, getting picked up, starting to experience kind of the rest of your trip. And so part of that is getting you reunited with your belongings as soon as possible. And so that's kind of how we think about it. The other piece is just making sure we have good partnerships with companies that do offer ride services, and making sure we make those connections as easy as possible.
Great. All right. Well, Robin asked a question. Hi, Robin. Which is something I would love to address as a Delta flyer. Obviously, one of the things that we've seen post-pandemic has been, and with the rise of these new terminals, let's take LaGuardia, for example, are the epic lines that are forming outside of lounges. I know in Delta's case, again, Delta as an airline, I think probably makes as much money at this point from selling American Express branded credit cards as it does from actually flying. And so therefore, those credit cards grant access to lounges. And Amex has built its own lounge chain. And so we see, because of, as Robin points out in her question, LaGuardia, beautiful new terminals, but they did not change airspace. They did not really fix the runway layout. So delays are still there. And it's creating these crowding conditions and customer dissatisfaction as well. I'd love to hear from the two of you in terms of like rethinking what the future of that experience is. I mean, obviously we make gates nicer, we've increased F&B, but obviously for airlines with their elite programs, there's this tension between customer retention and loyalty and offering that cut above. How do we start to rethink what loyalty means in the future of aviation, and what facilities we offer them to balance out that load? So I don't know, Amber, if you want to go first. I don't know how Alaska's dealing with this, what situation it has with its lounges. But yeah, how are you trying to load balance out across all those amenities?
I think it's interesting because we've seen incredible growth with our lounge program, and we continue to make investments in that program. It's very popular with our guests. And I think one of the strategies that we've done is just making sure that we are prioritizing our paid members as the folks that are most valuable. Those are folks who should have access to the lounge. When they get into the lounge, they should easily be able to find a seat. And that's kind of the way we think about the structure. This isn't my particular area, so I don't want to share too much about kind of things that are coming, but I do know it's been really important to us that we offer that experience to our lounge members as kind of the priority. And so it's something that you see within the industry. Things like priority pass are not always accepted at every lounge, and that's in service of protecting those who are actually direct members.
Great. And Warren, yeah, thoughts on this as well? I mean, obviously we've sort of seen like a lounge arms race across airports in addition to other amenities.
We have. The whole loyalty program is a beast all into itself, right? It is a whole other, like, as you said, companies like Delta are making a fortune off of selling the credit card itself. It's not just the travel. It is integral. Finance is integral to the air travel industry. I'm hoping to see, as the apps become more engaging and perks become more interesting for folks, not just as repeat travelers, but to inspire people to do more leisure travel or things of that nature. I'm hoping that the scheduling pieces that we talked about earlier, the ability to identify when downtimes may be, push people outside of those normal travel windows, will allow those things to be kind of mitigated by distributing it out better, making those services more available. I'm also wondering if we're going to see anything really embracing the history or the nerdiness or the love of air travel, like we see with the TWA terminal at JFK, where something is just iconic, and that piece of that icon can be distributed throughout the experiences for a given airline to make that brand experience richer in smaller things, as opposed to these lounges that are more kind of statutory places. If there aren't little or smaller things that can be distributed out at gates and things of that nature to make people more comfortable. In the same way we see folks walking around with iPads now and servicing folks wherever they may be, if I'm in the wing where all of the Alaska airline gates are, or all the Delta gates are, what prevents those services from coming to me all the way out down to the gate? That distribution mechanism from a technology perspective is there. And if the kitchen space or the facilities are improved or changed, or even ghost kitchens and things of that nature are used, similar to the way we saw things scale out in the pandemic, there could be a fundamental shift of what is a luxury zone within the airport itself.
Great. Yeah, also in addition to that one, and Hardy Chambliss has a couple questions. Thank you, Hardy. I'll get back to those. But the other thing I think of is I'm curious about whether one paradox of a world of remote work, and given the more tightly scheduled we are now in remote work, is that airports will have to actually add remote work facilities, because I think a lot of people in the lounges, certainly me, use it to basically take calls, because you are doing a ballet where you're going off the plane immediately into a call, or running right out of the lounge into that. And so it's sort of interesting, the more, rather than killing air travel, they become more tightly coupled together in a weird paradoxical way. I do want to go, let's see, I think related to this Hardy question here, the Disney Magic Band is magical because all the tech is controlled and optimized for the experience, replicating similar experiences in the real world's constraints and requirements. I think you can read this as well. Terminals provide a similar closed system to execute this, but can you do it without increasing the fees from the airlines and airports? And there's another question as well, too, about the role of the airlines versus airports in ground transportation. So let's take those two questions. I'm assuming the two of you can see them as well, and combine that. What is going to be the role going forward? And Amber, you can take this first, of the airline versus the airport in thinking through these experiences and thinking through the optimization. How is Alaska's conversations with Portland and SeaTac go in this regard? And what are those relationships like?
Yeah, it's interesting. When we think about those, we want to make sure that we're doing the best thing for our guests. And so we look at ourselves as being advocates for that experience. And so if it's ground transportation, especially if there are remote gates and it involves a bus, we want to make sure it's a great experience for those guests that need to use that, which is, I think we all have that feeling sometimes when we walk up and we see that it's a bus gate, we're like, okay, this is going to be different. It means I'm going to get on the plane earlier. I'm going to be riding on a bus. It's kind of something, it was unexpected. And so I think from that point, we really look at changing that experience into something positive. And so I think that's the role that we have. We've played around with different concepts. We've even played with lounge pop-up concepts near busing gates to just offer something that's we know this isn't what you were expecting, even though that's something it's just a byproduct of growing airports. And we know that sometimes it's necessary to park a plane in those locations. So I think being transparent with guests about where they're going, how they're going, that's going to continue to increase. And then making sure that we are working with our port counterparts, that the buses are there, they're professionally driven, they're clean, and it's a good experience if it does need to be in that kind of ground transportation environment.
Thanks. And then, Warren, what do you see more broadly as well?
So this is the biggest opportunity that I see, period. Interoperability is the number one challenge that we're talking about here. The Disney Magic Band works because all of the Disney park is controlled by Disney and no one else. And an airport is a large ecosystem with lots of different competing stakeholders. You can have the port, which has their own sets of goals and ambitions. You have all of the airlines, all of the other ground transportation services, et cetera, et cetera. And all of them are striving to take care of their guests, their customers. At some point, it has to be the traveler, period. Not just the person that not just the relationship that they have with a given airline, given ground transportation solution, parking transportation solution, whatever that may be. If I can now access all of those services and these various players are feeding information to one another, that's when the traveler really gets an amazing experience above and beyond. And it's a difficult space because it adds a lot of potential for competition, right? It's not just the specific relationship or the elegance that one company has invested with. One airline, for example, if they've made a large investment with Uber, they've tightened an integration with them, and they can now get ground transportation really dialed through, or with a rental company, that's a benefit that that traveler gets from that airline. I think if we can pool these things together so that all of those services are available, one of the key elements I think of this question is without the additional fees, creating that marketplace for that information so that it is all there and all of these folks can benefit from it. And then each of them can take that information and surface insights and differentiates themselves by how intelligent they take, how much intelligence they can imbue into those insights. That's when things are really going to shift. And I don't know what yet pushes companies to make that investment, because right now they're all having to do it on their own. And that it's going to take, I think, a push from the outside, from passengers, to start to push for this to open up, or additional cooperation between those companies.
Great. All right. Well, I thank everyone for the questions so far here. I've got one more question, and then I think we might wrap unless there's another incoming wave here, which is, oh, another question just popped in. Or where did that one just come from? Oh, will today's speakers attend CoMotion Miami event next week? I don't believe so, but we'll come back to that one. Thank you, Bashir. But I guess the last question I have is, we've talked mostly about obviously American airports, and we've talked a bit about our favorites. I know Joyce is going to talk more about airports to Paris, and obviously the work that they're doing around the world. And I guess I'm curious, like, Amber, perhaps a bit beyond your bailiwick, but I'm curious, like, what inspiration the two of you are drawing from international airports, and what we think the experience is beyond. Because obviously, to your point earlier, Warren, like, Singapore, what they've done with the Pearl, which is, or sorry, the Jewel, which is Moshe Safdie's incredible setup. I mean, huge amounts invested in international airports. What can we learn from them in the States? I mean, I know 15 years ago, you had the likes of Thomas Friedman, going to Beijing and saying, the classic, New York is the third world kind of comments by our now president, Joseph Biden. But yeah, what can we learn from what's happening overseas? Because obviously the future of aviation is not really an American phenomenon. It's all of these cities across Southeast Asia and Central Asia and South Asia. And I'm sort of curious, like, what can we launder back into the United States, or what do we think are the most transferable lessons from there? So I don't know if anyone's particularly inspired by international trips abroad. It's been a while since, it's been a pandemic since I did a lot of international travel. But someone like to go first. Yeah, Warren.
I can at least talk about how we talk about this in the design space. And that is that this outside of the US, even just up in Vancouver, right up north from where we are here in Seattle, the airport is not seen as just a travel destination. It is a place where a community works. It is part of the community. Up in Canada, airports are nonprofits, right? It's a totally different interaction. So Singapore, for example, that whole gem was built for the people that live there, not necessarily for the travelers. That was an added bonus. Right? It was meant to be a destination. I think that's the shift for us. If we can look at the airport as a hub of all transportation, whether that be rail, light rail, air travel, ground transportation, et cetera, and actually bring it into our community, that will fundamentally shift the way that we think about it and use it today. And as Amber was mentioning earlier, especially in these metropolitan areas, here in Seattle is a key example. The land itself is very constrained. We don't have space to build another runway. SeaTac is positioned right between Seattle and Tacoma. It's like right in the way. If that was a bridge between those two cities and something that allowed people to go through it and use it on a regular basis, it's going to change the way we think about it. It doesn't have to be the future vision that we saw a couple of years ago, where people were saying, well, what if the airport was in the dead center of the downtown area? What would that be like? I don't think it needs to get to that space, but it does need to become something that is more than just for air travel. It needs to be a part of our communities. And I think that will change not only the function of the airport, but the way that it feels, because if it's part of our community, it needs to represent the community that it's in. And that makes it a more comfortable space to be in all around, representative of the people and the spirit that's there.
Amen to that. And yeah, Amber, anything particularly overseas that that guided you in your own lobby recreation experience as well, or where you draw inspiration from?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I want to talk a little bit about the technical piece of it. And as we were considering this idea of automated bag drops, because we knew we had a problem specifically with SeaTech started the conversation, but I think the work in Portland and SFO, sorry, San Francisco, LAX, like all of this kind of brought to light this idea of we need to improve the throughput, which means we need to shorten the duration of the transactions that are happening in the lobby so folks can really flow. And we don't see flow today. We see lines. We don't want lines. And so we actually had team members, really go see this in action. It's interesting because in the international market, specifically in Australia and Asia, as well as Canada, they've been using automated bag drop technology for a decade. And we really haven't seen it in the US yet come to life. And so we wanted to see, like, how does it work? Can folks figure it out without a lot of agent interaction? Because if there's a lot of agent interaction, it kind of defeats the purpose. We want to make sure our agents are there to really help people in their unique situation and not just be transaction processors in these large hub airports. And that's really where we're focused, is on our hub airports and creating that more space and flow. And so as we did visits to those and see them in action, we learned a lot from what's possible. I will call out a specific example that we saw with WestJet is they are using automatic bag drop, and they actually were one of the first airlines, I think in North America, that introduced this idea of the kiosk only allows you to print your bag tag. So they took their standard kiosk, but they reduced the functionality. And they're having check-in happen ahead of time. They're having boarding passes there's no more paper boarding passes for WestJet. And to be able to see them make that shift, I think it just it confirms that we're going in the right direction with that, as well as the way their folks interact with bag drop. It's going to be it's going to be a change, right, in the domestic market. It's not something we're used to. Greg, I love what you said. It's so ingrained in your brain that you go to the airport, you go to a kiosk, you print the thing, you stand in the line. Well, what happens when you did all of that before and you get to the airport and there's no line? You just go to an open machine. So it's going to be fun. It's going to be different. But I think from an experience standpoint, I can't wait because I'm going to be that much closer to my coffee on the other side.
Amen to that. All right. Well, on that note, it's been a pleasure here. I would say Morgan's dropped into the chat here. I want to highlight here promo code for attendees today. If you want to do last minute registration for Miami next week, it's Como Live. So, perhaps you can go run into the CoMotion team at MIA. So if you happen to be at the Delta Sky Club at LaGuardia on Saturday, I will see you there in the morning. So you can say hi. I want to thank Warren. I want to thank Amber. Thank you both so much for joining us and really, laying out this really exciting vision for the future of air travel. It's been wonderful. Morgan, take us home.
Thank you so much, Greg. A wonderful, excellent moderator. Thank you, Warren and Amber. You all had so many interesting points to bring up. Honestly, I really learned a lot today, and it makes me excited to travel a bit more in the near future, hopefully. So thank you all attendees also for joining today on the session. Terminals are getting a makeover, the future of air travel. If you've enjoyed the session as much as I have, I highly recommend also checking out our Fast Forward podcast, which is available on all your podcatchers. Our most recent episode was with the CEO of Cavenue, Tyler Duval, looking at smart roads to unlock the full potential of connected and autonomous vehicles. So thank you all again for joining today. I hope to see you in Miami next week, if not, hopefully at our next webinar or our next in-person event. Have a wonderful rest of your days and take care.
Thanks.